Hello, Indy Reformed. This is the video for week 5, day 3. This is the Mosaic Covenant. Yesterday we looked at the Abrahamic Covenant and what all that means. The Mosaic Covenant comes hundreds of years later in redemptive history, over 400 years later. So after the death of Abraham, as we continue reading in Genesis, we see that eventually the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites, go down to Egypt. And this is how God preserves them, saves them from a severe famine. And we keep reading and we see that eventually they become slaves to the Egyptians and they are oppressed by them for 400 years. And then God sends one of his own people, Moses, to deliver them. And we read of the stories of the plagues and the exodus of the people out of Egypt, the walk through the Red Sea on dry ground, and the Pharaoh and his armies drowning in the Red Sea. And then they come to Mount Sinai. And God makes a covenant with his people on Mount Sinai that we know as the Mosaic Covenant. So in Exodus 24, we read these words: Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all of his rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words the Lord has spoken, we will do. So we see here that this is part of the covenant ceremony that we've talked about before. We saw in the Abrahamic covenant that only God goes through the pieces of the animals and only God is responsible for keeping this covenant. Well, here we have something a little different. Here we have the people having a responsibility as well. They say, all these things we will do. It's basically taking themselves in the covenant and saying, if we break this, may the curses of the covenant fall upon us. Now we need to pay careful attention to what is exactly going on in this covenant, because we can get confused rather easily if we take this too simplistically. It's an important thing to recognize that the Mosaic Covenant does have the grace of God in it. It's an administration of the covenant of grace, and we see the grace of God coming to his people, and that people under the Mosaic Covenant are only saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in the coming Christ alone. We also see something else in the Mosaic Covenant. We see that there's an aspect for the nation of Israel. And as a nation in the earthly promised land, if they obey this covenant, they will be blessed. If they disobey this covenant, they will be cursed and eventually exiled, thrown out of God's land. And we can see this in places like Exodus 24, where we see that they have a responsibility to keep this covenant in order to remain in the land that God has given them. And so we can ask, why was this part of the Mosaic Covenant? What purpose did it serve? Well, it was meant to lead us to Christ. It was meant to show us that we cannot gain heaven through our own obedience. Israel did not even have to obey perfectly to remain in the earthly promised land, and they couldn't do that. So how much less are we able to obey perfectly to gain the heavenly promised land? We see here in the Mosaic Covenant our sinfulness and our inability to live with God in righteousness and holiness. It shows us that we need to look somewhere else for our law keeping, for our righteousness, for our standing with God that's anything other than judgment. The Mosaic Covenant also shows us much about the coming Messiah. King, priest, prophet, and sacrifice play a very important part in this covenant moving forward in redemptive history. And it's only by understanding these things that we can understand what Jesus is as prophet, priest, king, and sacrifice. And so as the rest of the Old Testament, from the middle of Exodus on, is under the Mosaic Covenant, it's an important thing to understand and to remember. And ultimately, the Mosaic Covenant was never meant to be the final covenant. It was never meant to be the end-all, be-all. It was always meant to lead us to the new covenant and the grace of Christ that we find there. And we'll start looking at that here in a couple days.